Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you are having a really good holiday period. If you celebrate Christmas, I hope that your Christmas was excellent. If you don't, then I hope you had a restful time of holiday and wishing everyone a happy new year. Now, I thought I'd do a bit of theory in addition to the model building. So I've got my son's felt tip pens while the rest of the household is out and after I've finished work. And I'm going to be doing a series of videos on War Studies 101, so basics of war studies. So a bit of background about myself. I have loved building model tanks and airplanes from an early child. Right up to now when I'm a big child in my 40s. I had the privilege of studying war at King's College London. I wanted to go into the military, which is incompatible with asthma. So I studied war at King's College London. I achieved a first BA honours. I loved my time there. I studied just at the start of the 2000s, just before everything kicked off in 2001 in Afghanistan, and then later when it all kicked off in Iraq. So that was the time period that I studied. War studies at King's College London, you study everything. So you study what war is, you study the hardware of war, you study the economies of war, you know, what builds and keeps them in the field. You study politics, you study strategy, you study the rules of war, you study the laws of war. I specialised in the former Yugoslavia wars, the wars in the former Yugoslav state. Not a nice thing to specialise in, and also in Vietnam War films. So that's my field of expertise. Unfortunately, reality bit, I ran out of money. I didn't have enough money to get and go do a master's. So I went into the car industry and then into retail and then into the job that I'm currently in. And the job that I'm currently in is one which prevents active political engagement. So during this series, I won't be covering like which political party is right, which political party is wrong, or anything like that, because that would be politically active. So I'll be focusing it on the study of war, keeping my opinions, which are my personal opinions, around the study of war, the theory of war, and relating that to how you can use this, one, to build better model kits, and two, to understand war. Now, for various reasons, war does touch on politics, but it touches it at a different level to being politically active. So the first question we have to ask is, what is war? So there's lots of definitions for what war is, and I believe that most of those are quite misleading. There's lots of people saying, well, what is a war, and why is a war different to, say, a campaign of terrorism, or why is a war different to, if you like, general tension that exists in the world every single day. So hopefully I'll try and explain that to you. Now, the viewpoints that I'm going to put to you is based on my studies. I'll try and keep it simple, and they revolve around someone called Clausewitz. So I will be touching on Clausewitz quite a lot. And the reason I'll be touching on Clausewitz is because you have to understand what an armed conflict actually is. Now, there's various definitions for armed conflict, and some of them are more complicated than others. So, for example, if you go on the Save the Children website, it will say that there is a war is an armed conflict where organised party take action against civilians or against each other, so other organised groups, and in one battle within 1 year, 25 people die. Okay, so it's a helpful definition, and it gets us to at least think of organisation. But what it doesn't do is it's very specific, and it gives us this figure of 25, which obviously, as a war studies theorist, I would say, well, what happens if only 23 people die? And that's why that definition suddenly falls apart. So it helps in some ways. Now, the thing I'd pick out from that definition is that it includes organisation. Now, if we take war without organisation, we take war without any kind of definition or any kind of structure, what we actually have is we have mass murder. Okay. So I'll make that clear. War is killing. War is without any form of structure or anything to control it. We have mass murder. And that's why you have to understand what's called the laws of war, and you have to understand what's called the rules of war. Now, by what I mean by the laws of war and rules of war, I am not referring to the Geneva Convention. Okay, the Geneva Convention, if I can spell it correctly, that is to do with the laws of armed conflict. So just as in the law, you have civil law, you have common law, you have criminal law. So criminal law would be enforced by the police and the court system. Civil law would be dealt with via the courts, and common law would be the rights applicable to all individuals, which in the United Kingdom have been brought by PACE under the control of the state. So the laws of war here and the Geneva Convention is something separate. What I'm referring to here is that even in its most murderous state, so when people are dying in their thousands, civilians are being killed, people are being persecuted, tortured, shot and murdered, there are still rules that apply. Now, these are, if you like, and one of the better ways is calling it is game rules. So every conflict, however sinister, has a series of laws and rules that apply to them. And I'm not referring to the laws of armed conflict. That's a completely different subject area. But every war or every armed conflict has some form of law and some form of rules in that war, the rules of the game, and they are different for each situation, which prevent war from being mass murder. So if you didn't have some form of laws and some form of rules, and I'm not talking about legal rules, so I'll make that clear that we'll keep legal rules outside of it for a minute. There are basic laws and rules which apply to the game, which control warfare and stop it from being mass murder. If you didn't have any control and had absolute anarchy, war would literally just be mass murder. It would be pointless mass murder. So the best way to understand war, and I believe the only way that has actually stood the test of time, is a person called Clausewitz. Now, Clausewitz was a theorist, very influential theorist, and I believe the only theorist on war that has actually got a decent definition of war which applies to every single situation and which applies across every age. So Clausewitz's definition is war is a continuation of politics by other means. Now, this is really important because Clausewitz connects war to politics. And in terms of politics of his day, what Clausewitz is referring to here is the state. Okay, so the state, as Clausewitz thinks of it, was to do with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Now, what that meant was that the state, so kings, princes, rulers of the state, their state politics, so what they were doing with their countries, was what war was part of. So if you had a leader in, say, a small German principality, and he went to war with his neighbouring principality, it would be to seize land or to gain an initiative or to prevent a threat. Now, this all comes down to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And what that was really giving princes or rulers the right to control the religion and the politics of what was going on in their state. So you have these little states, some of them bigger than others, and it basically means this state here has the right to control what it's doing, and this one here has the right to control what it's doing. Now, I believe that Clausewitz's definition has actually stood the test of time, because if we extrapolate this and say, well, war is a continuation of politics by other means, and if we go back to what makes war different from mass murder, is that actually mass murder, however brutal and however terrible it is in war, is always connected to a political outcome. or a political goal. Now that applies, and this is why I love the definition that Clausewitz made, is one, it was relevant when he was writing it many years ago. It was as relevant after 1648, and it's as relevant as it is today. So if we think of any war within the history of warfare, whether we take it from Roman times, whether we take it to today with what Hamas is doing, there is always a political element. So Hamas, or the IRA, or non-state actors as they are called, terror groups as defined by law. It is illegal in the UK to support Hamas, and the IRA, also the real IRA, are regarded and defined as terrorists. They have a political goal or outcome, and in the case of the IRA, of course, they are connected to Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin is a political organisation, and the IRA for many years was their military wing. It has splintered and fragmented since, but there was a clear goal, a political goal, and that was why the IRA were using force. And that was why, in the minds of the IRA, they were not committing mass murder. They were committing it for a political purpose. Now, of course, if you are a terrorist group, you are being illegal, if I can spell it correctly. Therefore, you don't have the legal right to use that force. But if you take Clausewitz's definition, there is a clear political purpose to that use of force, which helps you understand it. And that's why I don't believe it's helpful at this point to study what is legal and what is illegal, because it gets confusing. What you have to understand is that even Hamas, however murderous they are, and the fact that they're a prescribed terrorist organisation, certainly in Britain, they have a political purpose. Now, we'll come on to whether they've actually achieved that or whether they've set themselves back from that. But war is separated from mass murder because the people conducting it will have a political purpose. However illegal that purpose is, you have to understand why they're doing it. Now, Clausewitz, obviously, and if we go back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and we go back to what is a state, essentially, and I'll keep this brief, a state is a means of controlling tax. So in the medieval period, warfare was becoming more and more expensive. Before then, you had a feudal system with barons controlling and giving allegiance to the king and giving a certain number of days and a certain number of nights every year to go and fight for him or her. Now, war became more expensive and there needed to be a way of gathering and maintaining revenue. And what you have there is the growth of the state. Now, the state is an actor which pretty much always has legality in its actions, whereas Hamas and the IRA, terrorist groups, don't have legality in their actions, and their supporters will believe that they do. Now, the state obviously has its political objectives and means, and these other non-state actors do, but they're often achieving their means by illegal violence. So we need to set aside legality, and we need to set aside what is legal and what is illegal to understand war. And what we have to focus on there is war is a continuation of politics by other means. Now, if you take this down and you take even these non-state actors have a political goal, then every war and every example of armed conflict, including those where states fight each other and where non-state actors fight states, this, I believe, Clausewitz's definition allows us to understand what's going on. And Clausewitz carefully says by other means. So he incorporates everything, and that's the great thing about Clausewitz. This is a definition which works for terrorist campaigns and it works for wars between states. And that's why I believe it's the best definition to have and to work with. So if we then go on to what Clausewitz says, well, Clausewitz says the objective of war is to disarm your opponent and compel, spelt wrongly, them to do your will. And that's by Clausewitz. Now, that is really important to understand. The objective is to disarm your opponent and compel them to do your will. So if you are going to win a war or achieve victory in a war, whether you are Hamas or the IRA, and I point out Hamas is proscribed, it is illegal, you need to disarm your enemy and compel them to do your will. So if you think about that in a situation where a burglar has come into someone's house, the person in the house is resisting the burglar is armed with a knife, the person who owns the house takes that knife from the burglar's hand, manages to restrain them until the police arrives. That person has disarmed them and has compelled them to do their will. And that's the same in war. What the IRA wanted to do was to disarm, to remove the British presence in Northern Ireland. I'm not entirely sure what Hamas was trying to do on October the 7th, and we'll come to that in a minute. But if you take the objective of the Allies in World War II, their objective was to disarm Nazi Germany and to disarm Imperial Japan and compel them to do their will. So they disarmed Germany in a conventional war campaign fought over many years to defeat the German army on the battlefield, to defeat the German economy via strategic bombing and blockade, to take the territory and to eliminate the Nazi German forces. Once those forces were beaten, destroyed, defeated, Nazi Germany was compelled to do their will of the Allies. In the battle in the Pacific, it ended up with the use of non-conventional weapons, atomic weapons, to cause a collapse in the Japanese morale and compel the Japanese to do their will, which was to surrender. So here we have, we'll go back to it, Clausewitz again. War is a continuation of politics by other means. The objective is to disarm your own opponent and compel them to do your will. Keep that in mind as we study the next part. Now, this definition, and the beauty of this definition, is it relates to every single war in history. The definitions like the definition from Save the Children, and I certainly have nothing about this against Save the Children. They are an exceptional organisation which do a good job. But if you start saying, well, 25 people need to die in one battle every year and only 23 die, do you have a war? So the Clausewitz's definition, I believe, you can take and apply to any conflict. So if we think about the war in Vietnam, the Americans' goal was to stop the spread of communism. Their goal was to defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. If we take the goals of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they wanted to disarm South Vietnam and they wanted to unite South Vietnam. So that was their political objective. Now, in this war, despite the fact that many people say, oh, America won all the battles or America achieved victories, actually, America failed to stop the spread of communism within Vietnam. And they did that because they alienated the North Vietnamese independent movement, forcing them further into the hands and arms of the communist regimes. And also because the domino theory didn't apply, they misread a regional conflict. And actually, their political objective of stopping the spread of communism was actually completely unrealistic. They were also on the battlefield, despite many battlefield successes, and people say, oh, Linebacker 2, what an example of the use of strategic air power. No. They were disarmed by the North Vietnamese because after the signing of Linebacker in 1972, the American political situation and the will to be involved in the war collapsed by 1973. And by 1975, the Americans were no longer supporting the South Vietnamese regime for various reasons, and the political goal of uniting Vietnam was achieved. So here we can see that war is a continuation of politics by other means, and we can see it in practice. So let's have a quick look at the Russo-Ukraine war, and I'll be careful not to get into politics. But what are the Russian objectives? Well, the first one is a land grab. Now, the reason I'm not covering legality of war at this stage is that in law you have a right to self-defense. Now, ultimately, whether Putin has this right to self-defense can only be determined by trial by the appropriate authorities, which would be the International Criminal Court, based on the crime of aggression. So until that is done, we have to say that one of the objectives of the Russians is actually to take land. They want to take the Donbass area of Ukraine, and they want to keep hold of the Crimea. So that is a Russian political objective. Their next objective is to disarm Ukraine. And by disarm Ukraine, they are aiming to, one, smash up the Ukrainian armed forces, and they also want to weaken the will of NATO and the West to support Ukraine. So they are not necessarily seeking to take all of Ukraine or to destroy all of Ukraine's armed forces, but they want to remove the will of NATO and the West and the Ukrainian armed forces to fight them. They are trying to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That is a key Russian objective, and by doing that, they have engaged Ukraine in a war. Now, the reason I believe that they have engaged Ukraine in a war, although they call it the special military operation, special military farce, whatever you want to call it, depending on your political persuasion, once that war has started, that gives NATO a choice. NATO can either keep escalating the war, send its troops ultimately to defend Ukraine, or it will have to maintain the war as a proxy war, because to get involved in a war with the Russians as NATO will eventually result quite quickly in a nuclear bang. And both sides need to avoid that. So the next Russian political objective is to control escalation. So they are trying to disarm Ukraine by defeating the will of the West to support Ukraine, and they are trying to stop it from going to a nuclear war. Ukraine's political objective is quite clear. They are trying to preserve their political system. They are trying to preserve an independent Ukrainian state, and they are trying to resist what they see as aggression, which ultimately would be tried by the International Criminal Court as a right of self-defense. Now, let's have a look at a non-state actor, and we will have a quick look without getting in too much detail, and I'll leave this as a question for you all to think about till we come on to the next War Studies 101. And I want to think about the situation of Israel and Hamas. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics of who's right and who's wrong. I'm not going to discuss the legal matters and whether one side has committed war crimes or others. I just reinforced the fact that in the United Kingdom, expressing support for Hamas is expressing support for a prescribed terrorist organisation, so I will not be doing that. So let's have a look at what the Israeli political objectives are. Well, the only objective that they have given so far is to destroy Hamas. So they want to disarm Hamas and compel Hamas to do their will. Now, this is incredibly difficult to achieve because Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Now we go back to Chairman Mao's theory. So Chairman Mao has this theory of the guerrillas swimming in a sea. The sea here represent the people, and these are little fishies. So these little fishies are ambivalent or not committed, but they provide an area where the little, I'll make this a shark, where the little terrorist can hide. Now, Hamas, the only objective that I can think that Hamas was trying to achieve on October the 7th was to do with Saudi Arabia and stopping the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So Israel is trying to destroy this shark, but the shark is swimming in a sea of people. That makes it incredibly difficult as a state that has to obey the rules of war, as do all actors in war, to defeat Hamas and disarm them and compel them to do their will. They can take out Hamas by guided missile strikes. They can take out Hamas by artillery strikes. They can go and invade and get into the tunnels. They use the term invade there loosely. They can go into the tunnels and they can fight Hamas. They can find Hamas. The problem in doing so is that they have run the risk of killing this fish and killing this fish. And that will turn their political objectives into something which is harder to realise. Because these fish here might have little fish, children fish, nephew fish, relatives in other countries. And if they are undertaking such a level of violence that these other fish then turn into supporting the terrorist fish, it's counterproductive. The movement goes on. And that's why dealing with non-state actors is very difficult. Now, let's turn our attention to Hamas. And again, Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organisation. You can only say that they were trying to stop the normalisation of relations with Saudi Arabia. However, just as a terrorist fish needs to have the support of the other fishes that it operates in for cover. Okay, so we go back, we draw a terrorist fish, and then we draw all the fish around the world. Okay. Now, I said at the start that war is something separate between war and mass murder. When a terrorist organisation does an atrocity which is so vile and so stomach-churning, these fish, instead of being cover for it, they go, do you know what? I'm not supporting that. And that's what happened with the IRA when they started blowing up shopping centres. They lose their cover. So in my view, and if you think of war being a continuation of politics by other means, what Hamas has done, rather than disarming Israel, is more likely to backfire on it and to make all these other fish really angry and support the destruction of Hamas, irrespective of the damage that is done to the civilian population that Hamas swims in. So you, even as a terrorist, and I'm not talking about legal rules here, I'm talking about general rules, if you go too far on the scale of violence as a terrorist, you lose that cover. And that is why I believe that despite the fact that Israel cannot really achieve its objective of destroying Hamas, what I think has actually happened here is I think Hamas has committed suicide. I think that's what they've done, because they've not failed to follow the rules, and I'm not talking about the laws, because they clearly haven't followed those. I'm talking about the general rules of the game. They've gone too far. All of these fish here will accept more violence than what a democracy would normally be able to undertake to disarm them. So that's why I believe that the definition of Clausewitz still stands today, and you can apply it to any situation that you want. And again, I would ask you, when you're looking at war, to say, okay, war is a continuation of politics by other means, and the objective is to disarm your opponent and compel them to do your will, as paraphrased by me from Clausewitz. And that will help you understand what war is, and it will help you to put war in context. Now, again, I'm not politically active, so this is an understanding of war only, but I hope this helps you to think of any war in history, and I challenge you to find one war in history where there wasn't some form of political objective, and one war in history, however brutal and however destructive, where there wasn't some form of laws or some form of rules governing the game, which makes war different to mass murder. Now, in the next episode, we'll cover the legality and the legal side of war. But hopefully this has given you an understanding as to what war actually is. Let me know if this is helpful. I'm doing this as an aside from building lots of models, and I'll be building the Gulf War Vulcan next. Take care, everyone, and have a good day.